This is Jerry Barrett talking. Today's date is March 11th, 1986. I'm interviewing Dick McGraw in his office in Washington, D.C. Dick, as you probably know, I'm interested in the labor relations negotiations and relationships that went on at Eastern in the period of the early 80s to the present. You had some role in some of that. Could you...
part of the time I did, anyway.
Yeah. Can you just kind of chronologically tell me what you can about that period?
Well, I came in to Eastern middle of August 15th of 1983. And I was hired, Frank told me, because he needed some help in reestablishing some credibility with the employees. He was not happy with his employee communications program and said he needed some help in it. He was not happy with the way the company was perceived publicly. As I gathered, they had come through the strike threat of April that spring, and I gathered that Frank and or the company were left a little bloodied by the confrontation with the machinist union particularly. That was in August, and then, boy, the dates may not be precise, but that fall, well, let me say first that I met with Charlie Bryant, Machinist Union. I met with the Pilots Union people, and I met with the flight attendants individually, and expressed my view that whatever disagreements we have, number one, we should keep to ourselves. Turn that off. I've got to.
How do you do that?
There's the red button there. Oh, no, I'm in your machine here.
Oh.
Yeah.
So we're back on.
Yeah, I met with the three union leaders, giving them my view that whatever disagreements we have, we ought to keep private to ourselves and not take them public, because taking them public affects traffic and revenues. And we're better if we can have our disagreements and keep them to ourselves. And there was, at that time, as I recall, a disagreement coming up with the flight attendants. I think they had a strike deadline scheduled for October the 12th, it seems to me. It was, and it was early to mid-October. There was a strike deadline coming, and we were not having much success. And somewhere about that time, Continental filed Chapter 11. And we had put together a couple of pieces, videotape or letters, or a combination of both, to go to the employees to make the case that we needed some concessions in total compensation, wages, if we were going to be able to stay alive in that business, in that industry, in that market, especially in our markets, making the case that deregulation was not even-handed in its application. It was primarily an East Coast phenomenon during the first half a dozen years or so, which happens to be Eastern's primary markets, the East Coast north-south routes. And in fact, we went back and we had the tape cut once on a Friday night. Saturday, Continental filed Chapter 11. Sunday, we went back and cut the tape again, this videotape, pointing out at Continental's Chapter 11 filing. And Frank said on tape that, as distasteful as it may be, and these are not his exact words, that may be something we have to consider. Now, we made several hundred copies of that tape and distributed it around the system for employees to see, and of course, as soon as we did, the press picked it up, and it gave us headlines we didn't really want about ComSat considering filing Chapter 11. So whatever I had said with regard to keeping our our disagreements to ourselves with the employees went out the window. Once that became, because the unions saw this as a ploy, a tactic by management to negotiate publicly by laying on the whole world the threat of bankruptcy in order to pressure the unions into negotiating wage concessions. That was not our intention at all. But with 40,000 people spread around 260 some odd locations, there's no way to communicate with them privately. Just virtually impossible. So any attempt to communicate with them found its way into the public domain. That did work itself out, however, thanks to Bill Ussery's coming on board. Well, let me get a couple of things straight here. As I recall, I ran into Bill and on the way into Frank's office in September of '83. Introduced myself to him. I recognized him, of course, and we struck up a pretty good conversation and got on pretty well very early on. He had trouble initially getting the machinists and the pilots and the flight attendants to accept that he would have a role, a significant role. They didn't, because they wouldn't accept the company's financial numbers. They wanted an independent analysis assessment. So between Bill, or among Bill and Frank and Charlie Bryan and well, I can't remember who was head of the flight attendants at the time, the redheaded woman, Pat, I forgot her last name, and the pilots and Wayne Yeoman, who was the chief financial officer, they came up with two people, or two organizations, that we would agree to assess the books, come to their own conclusion with the proviso that the unions would accept the findings of these independent groups. And we'll have a press conference to announce that. And it took the next 45 or 60 days or so was spent looking at that. And that produced the wage investment program. The results of that analysis by those two independent groups, and Bill's working with the details of that is what produced the wage investment program of 1984, which was unique in all of industry, I believe, in terms of the pieces and what it meant to the company. It was 18 to 22% wage concession in return for 2 additional seats on the board. I think that's right. I think that's right. To 22%. We're trying to think what the negotiations were. In '85, that's right. That's right. 2 additional seats on the board. As it's my, I believe I recall being told that as a result of an earlier wage program, the pilots and the non-contract employees were granted representation on the board by 2 members, or 2 new board members. Not 1 each, but the 2 of them together would have 2 representatives. And those, and I think the pilots mainly were the force in choosing those 2 representatives. They were Art Taylor and Tommy Boggs. And as a result of the 1984 wage investment program, the machinists and flight attendants themselves were granted specific seats on the board. and it wound up being the two local presidents at the time, Charlie Brown and Callahan.
Mhm.
And that was that and the 18 to 22% wage and some relatively modest productivity improvements are what saved the company for 1984. There was a rather complicated payback program. It wasn't really a profit-sharing program. The profit-sharing program didn't come in until, at least the most current one, until negotiations for the 1985 program. During, we can get into as much detail of the 84, fall of 83, January of 84 discussions as you want to, but during the first part of 84, the first quarter, first half of 84, there was a tremendous amount of attention given to the company by labor leaders generally, labor writers, sociologists, industrialists, everybody that was looking at this, because Frank had established way back in 1977, Frank established what I believe to be one of the first wage investment programs or wage give-back programs in return for profit sharing, certainly in the airline industry, and I think in the American industry, as a trade-off, as a give-back. And this was like number 6 or number 7 in a series of things. In fact, that's part of what contributed to his problem. Since 1976 or 77, Eastern had had 6 or 7, and I can give you some of the details, 6 or 7 wage investment / wage give-back programs for which there was to have been a profit-sharing piece. Of course, what makes those things work is that if you have a profit-sharing program, the assumption is there will be some profits to share.
Yes.
And if there aren't those profits to share, then the employees think, all this is a ruse to get into my pockets. What they really want is some of my wages, and then they're not going to. For 2 of those 7 years, there were no profits to share. I'm sorry. For only 2 of those 7 years were there profits to share. For 5, there were no profits to share. And that cost Frank dearly in terms of credibility. It destroyed his credibility with the employees. The terrible, terrible thing about it is that Frank's motivation could not have been more pure. Frank loves Eastern employees as though they were his own personal family. The 42,000, whatever the number is now, employees at Eastern, Frank has a personal affinity for. He feels a tremendous loyalty to them above anything else. He doesn't want them to be hurt. He doesn't want to lay them off. He doesn't want them to suffer any pay cuts. And it's that concern for them, that love for them, that desire to not see them hurt, that brought him the greatest magnitude of the problem. He wouldn't, and perhaps his judgment was best, but he wouldn't go for the maximum amount of wage cut that the company needed to almost guarantee success. He wanted to take as little wage cut as he could get away with, and believing that little bit of wage cut, that he believed that the employees understood, I believe, more than they really did understand. And he believed that they would acknowledge that a little bit of a wage cut, they would see the need to improve productivity, and there would be a profit to share, and that would solve the problem. The wage cut turned out not to be as big as was needed in order to reduce costs as much to make us profitable, and the employees were not as dedicated to the company as Frank is. Certainly not all 40,000 of them. There may have been a cadre of 1, 2, or even 5,000, although I think that's questionable. Bottom line was, he lost a lot of credibility, the company continued to lose money, and the employees began to lose faith in Frank's ability to manage the company. And it began to be a snowballing, mushrooming kind of a thing. And it finally got to the point that he was unsuccessful or almost unable to hold satisfactory negotiations. In fact, it was one of Bill Ussery's strong recommendations when he came in to leave the negotiations to the people in the company that had been identified as the negotiators, and he himself, Bill, acting as the emissary between the two.
Mm-hmm.
Frank had always played a very large role, and folks knew that Frank had always played a very large role, and whipsawed Frank. They would hold out, knowing that Frank was going to walk in the door at the last minute and cave in order to prevent the airline from going down, or for whatever good and valid reason Frank had.
So that was one of the things that Ussery did do, is get him to step back from the negotiations some.
He did get him to step back from the negotiations some. He was not as successful in the fall of '83 negotiations as he was in the latter part of '84 and the early part of '85 negotiations. Frank played a lesser role in '84 and '85 than he did in '83 and '84.
Mm-hmm.
And my understanding is he played even a lesser role in this most current here in early '86. I don't know that, but that's what I hear.
Mm-hmm. Were there large changes as a result of that study in late '83? Did the unions, in fact?
Yes, minds were changed. They did accept the recommendations. They accepted the study itself. When the study was done and the recommendations and the agreement was worked out, then there was a joint press conference with Bill and Charlie Bryan and the other two union leaders. I'm sorry, I forgot my name. The very head woman and the pilots. They had a joint press conference announcing the results of the study and what they had agreed to do about it.
Mm-hmm.
And Bill drafted a document that everybody signed. The very meticulous wording, as most labor relations documents are. Yes, they accepted the results of the survey, of the study, not survey, but the analysis of the financial data.
Mm-hmm.
The unions did accept that data, which was a milestone in itself because they had not before.
Did that help with the credibility as far as Frank Borman was concerned?
No.
No, it did not.
No, it did not help with Borman's credibility or with the company's credibility with the employees, for whatever reason. They could see the data, they understood the data, they believed the data, they didn't believe that the company was anymore keeping 2 or 3 sets of books, one to show the public, and not the public, but one to show the accountants and one to show the union people. They didn't believe that anymore, but they still believed that it was company mismanagement that got them this pickle in the first place.
Mm.
And that didn't, the results being believable, the analysis being believable, did not erase the incredibility that still existed.
Was part of your job to communicate that through video and other methods? Or how?
No, part of my, well, yes, that was part of the job, sure.
Mm.
Part of the job to do that. But part of my job was, the biggest part of my job was to reestablish and reinstill some credibility and some faith in the management of the company.
Mm-hmm.
That was the long-term task, and the task that I ultimately believed couldn't be done.
Mm-hmm.
I took the task, took Frank's charter to establish an employee communications program, a credible employee communications program, very, very seriously, and scouted around and found what I believe to be one of the best 5 employee communications people in the country, a fellow named Bob Hunter. And I figured when I went there that what we were looking at here was probably a 2 to 3 year program to turn around what needed to be turned around,
Mm-hmm.
and to establish an employee communications system that was believable and permitted a good flow of information up and down in the organization. recognizing that you're dealing with three unions and a non-union workforce that for all intents and purposes created four separate groups of people. This fellow that I hired, Bob Hunter, who is a person that you should see, by the way, and I spent probably 6 months trying to get things started and organized and going, and we came to the conclusion that it was not a 2 to 3 year program, but probably a 5-year program to do it. And finally, after about a year to a year and a half, we decided it couldn't be done as long as Frank and some of the other leaders are there. And the reason is the corporation itself, by virtue of Eddie Rickenbacker and his authoritarian style, Borman and his management style, which is not necessarily authoritarian, but his personal and management style are such that the communication system or structure or culture of the company looked to Frank as the leader from on Mount Olympus with a megaphone to lay the word on the employees. And as long as you had the employees expecting that, anything other than that wasn't going to work. Plus, whenever anything of importance was announced or made public to the employees, it came from Frank.
Mm-hmm.
So you constantly reinforced Frank's position as the sole source of information, thereby excluding every person in the mid-levels of management between the senior staff and the wrench turner. I mean, all those folks in the middle were left out of the communication process. They got the word the same time everybody else got the word. They had no answers to any questions, so they frequently adopted their subordinates' position rather than management's position because they were just as ignorant as their subordinates were. Not that you want to create necessarily additional levels, but if you have a tiered organization, then you've got to use the tiers for the flow of information, up as well as down. And Eastern couldn't do that, can't do that still. And the absence of that contributed also to the credibility problem, to the believability problem. Of course, people couldn't go to the supervisors and get good straight answers. The supervisors would say, "Hey, man, I know no more than you do. I'm on your side."
Mm-hmm.
So they just were not given good information. The flow broke down somewhere between Frank and the supervisory level. Somewhere in that process, it broke down.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what happened, but that contributed to the problem significantly.
And you used traditional and innovative ways to try to get a communication system working, but it
used both traditional and innovative ways. And Frank was a very strong supporter of it, a very strong supporter of it. Frank was insistent that we establish and get ensconced in Eastern first the quality circles program, and then the follow-on to quality circles was the employee participation.
Mm-hmm.
And Frank was a very strong and active supporter and a very strong believer in the effectiveness of those kinds of sharing information and decision-making sharing and communication flow. And it worked in pockets of the company, but it has yet to take hold throughout the entire organization.
Mm-hmm.
Were it to take hold, that itself produces a tremendous flow of information and knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
It works very well. As I say, Frank supports all those things very well. He hired me to help do that sort of thing. So he, on the one hand, his behavior said precisely what he wanted to do. But when it came to a crunch or to perhaps a crisis or the need to spread some information quickly, then he relied on the only system that he had. And I don't know that I would have done anything tremendously differently. Maybe I would have. To get information out. And of course, when you did, it was the same. It's Well, we heard the term bohicca. Bend over, here it comes again. I mean, anytime we went for something, it was, these guys don't know how to run business, they don't know how to manage the airline, get them the hell out of there and get somebody in here that knows.
Do you see some of that complaint that the employees just didn't like what was happening? That is to say, the industry had changed, and that was going to change their income. And so you got to have some, is it somewhat scapegoating, I guess is what I'm asking.
Sure, there's some of that.
Yeah.
There is some of that, but they'd say, why not look at American United? They didn't go through that, or Piedmont, or U.S. Air.
Mm-hmm.
But as I said, there's the application of deregulation was not even hindered. It was, for the first several years, an East Coast phenomenon.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And within the East Coast, a North-South phenomenon, the most heavily traveled routes.
And that's where Eastern was.
That was Eastern's primary market. We felt it worse than anyone else. We had just replaced a significant portion of our fleet, incurred a tremendous debt load. Operationally, we were doing fine, but the debt load, well, I shouldn't say operationally we were doing fine. We were not doing fine operationally because the biggest part of our operating costs was labor costs, and we couldn't get those down. Absent those, if you impose labor costs from competitive carriers, if you imposed our labor costs on Eastern, we'd have been in hog heaven.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because we all paid the same fuel costs, we all paid the same landing fees, we paid the same catering cost. We had a bigger debt load, but we paid the same interest fee. But operationally, we couldn't hack it because our labor costs were too high, far higher than our competitors.
The study in the fall of '83 showed that, as well as the current status of the company, didn't it?
No, the study was just it was just an analysis of Eastern's own financial books.
Wow, okay.
It was not a study of the marketplace.
Mm-hmm.
It was just an analysis of Eastern's own books compared to industry averages and some other knowns from some other companies in the industry.
Oh, yeah, okay. Do you see a difference at all between the four categories of employees, the three unions and the non-union people, in terms of where the more traditional kinds of communications would work, the kinds of things that you were trying to do, and versus from Borman down? In other words, did it work better some places than in others within those four groups of employees?
It worked better some places than others, but where it worked well and didn't work well was less a function of whether the employees were union, or if union, which union, than the general management of that location.
Ah, okay.
Locations that had managers who supported strong communications, in those locations it worked well. In locations that had managers that were not A, good communicators themselves, B, the location or the culture of that installation or that location was not good communications, then it broke down, irrespective of whether it was management or non-management or union or non-union.
Mm-hmm.
In the latter case, where good communications did not exist within the whole company, the union groups developed their own very effective networks and communications systems that were a very effective counter to anything the company tried to do. And Miami was probably the best case, because Miami did not have a good communications process, either for Miami base, or for the headquarters, or for the terminal, or the shops. Miami was very large, the largest, obviously, installation for Eastern in terms of number of people. About half of the employees of Eastern employees are in Miami, more than half. And if there's one place where you needed good communications, that was it.
Yeah.
On the other hand, Kansas City, which was a hub that we developed in 1980, in the spring and summer of 1984, and took people who volunteered, mostly volunteers from other locations, union and non-union alike. Boy, the communications at Kansas City were terrific. Marshal Wingo, who managed the Kansas City operation, the airport, and the employees who volunteered to go there were, you'd have to describe them as gung-ho people, gung-ho employees. They liked the company, they liked where they were there because they wanted to be there. They took an active role in the employee participation process, and it was a very high morale group of people. So it had less to do with unions than management philosophy, communications philosophy of individual locations.
What you just described, that took place in '84?
Yes.
They moving out there. How much longer were you with the company? Are you on into '85?
I left there in August to September of '85.
September.
Yeah, I was there just 2 years.
So you missed out on all this, the last round or two here.
Yeah, let me get that phone. Sorry. Yeah, I left there in September the 1st of '85.
Is your background in public relations or in employee involvement or?
My background is in communications.
Okay.
I'm a professional communicator.
Hey.
It doesn't matter what the audience is, I'm a professional communicator.
Okay. But the specific role you came into was basically internal communications of the organization, or it was external as well?
Yes, I had government affairs, employee communications, public relations, customer relations, baggage claims. That was most of it.
Okay. But a good bit of attention went to the internal problem because of the urgency of that.
It was the biggest problem that we had, and frankly, Frank correctly perceived the internal communications problem as the major problem that the company had, because it affected morale, it affected the way we dealt with customers, and if you're not happy within yourself and you spend all your time looking at your belly button, then you're not worrying about whether the customer's happy or not.
Yeah.
And the customer knows that and senses that very quickly. So one of the things I tried to do was divert attention from, let's stop looking at ourselves and worrying about our customer. Let's start affiliating ourselves with the marketplace. But all those things were marginally effective because we had so many internal problems, and that really prohibited us from doing the things that we wanted to do. I mean, it was year after year, month after month, one turmoil after another. It was one strike threat after another strike threat. It was one heavy loss after another. It's an impossible situation.
Must have been a frustrating 2 years for you.
It was the most frustrating time I spent in my life.
Really?
Without question. Without question. It was so frustrating that I decided I am beating my head against the wall. I am not able to do what I was hired to do, not because people don't want to do it, but because they are incapable of doing it. I found myself just totally incapable of doing what Frank had hired me to do and what I wanted to do and what I knew I could do, but it just wasn't happening there. Whether it was my fault, and I'm sure a large part of it was my fault, the company's fault, industry fault, I don't know whose fault. The problem is I couldn't do it and knew I couldn't do it and saw that I was spinning my wheels and was not happy, and life is too short to spend it that way, so I left.
Yeah, amen. That's certainly
And
true.
I took the employee communications guy with me.
Oh, you did?
Yes, I hired him right here.
You
I
didn't
didn't take him with me. He joined me 5 or 6 months later.
I see.
It's unfair to say I took him with me. That's not quite right.
Did you get involved in the negotiations at all?
I sat in on some of the negotiations, yes.
Were those generally cooperative, or were they pretty agitated and hostile and aggressive?
Some of each.
Huh?
So I don't think they were atypical of most union negotiations. There were some sessions that were very friendly and amiable and productive. There were more that were not, There were more that were table pounding. There were some where people acted like children and kicked wastebaskets and went out and slammed doors and yelled and screamed at the top of their lungs and used foul language and called people names and talked about the past, and there was far more of that than I thought there would be.
Mhm.
It's difficult sometimes to know how much of that is posturing
Yes.
and how much of it is inexperience on the part of some people, and how much of it is pure emotion. A large part of it is pure emotion. And how much of it is sincere negotiating tactics.
Mhm.
I suspect far less of the latter. One gets that feeling, and Bill can tell you much better. He saw a lot of it himself, but I sat in on all of the company's, the management's deliberations, and those got to be sometimes not hostile, but sometimes loud.
Mhm.
There were honest disagreements, but to the best of my knowledge, when we left the meeting, everyone was in concert.
Mhm. What were the issues? Somewhat feeling that they were giving the store away to the employees, and
Among the management people?
Yeah, I don't want to identify anybody, but just kind of a sense of what the issues were that caused the heat.
To cause the disagreement inside the
Yes.
the management.
Yeah.
Disbelief that the unions couldn't recognize what was happening in the marketplace.
Mm.
It was less disagreement among ourselves, although there was some of that, but less disagreement among ourselves as total disbelief that why can't those dumb so-and-sos see what's happening in the marketplace? Well, screw them. We'll just run our asses right into the ground. There was not very much of that, but the incredulity
Mhm.
of their positioning and their posture we just couldn't fathom it.
Mhm.
What the hell? Why can't they see what the hell's going on here? The only internal disagreements really dealt with how much of a wage cut was necessary to ask for, how much of a productivity increase we could anticipate or expect from each of the employer groups, how funny those dollars were versus how real they were as productivity improvement dollars.
Yes.
And as I say, there were not many big disagreements. Hell, the numbers spoke for themselves.
Mhm. Which in effect was part of the frustration that the employees would not understand that.
Exactly.
Was there much difference between the understanding that the pilots had and, say, the machinists or the flight attendants?
Going back, my understanding is going back to '83, that was the basis for part of the pilots' problem. The pilots had ponied up, in their term, the amount of let me see what that is.
Okay, we're back on now.
Okay. I believe that in '83, in the spring of '83, or maybe January, February of '83, when Frank recognized that he needed some sort of wage program in '83 in order to survive, he went to the pilots and possibly the flight attendants also, and negotiated what he thought was a pretty good deal. And the pilots contributed whatever percentage it was, and some increase in productivity, as I recall, although it wasn't there at the time. Then he went to the machinist, and the machinist said no. Then they refused to do anything. And they put some numbers on the table, and Frank said, we can't live with those. And the machinist said they would strike, and Frank said, we'll take the strike and fly through the strike, and got the employees all revved up to do that. And the employees were all motivated, and everybody had job assignments. They were going to fly through the strike. And then at the last moment, Frank went public saying he only had 12 days of cash left and he couldn't take the strike, and so he caved to the machinist's demands. That set up a dichotomy, difference between what he had been able to negotiate with the flight attendants and the pilots and what he was able to get from the machinist. And the machinist wound up not giving as much as the pilots and or flight attendants. So when the next round came to negotiate at the later in the year, when we started having the negotiations in the fall in the fall of '83 for all of '84 and '85, the pilots said, "We gave already. You know, I'm not giving another penny until you get out of Charlie Bryan and the machinist what you need to get out of them. When you get them up to the level that I have contributed, then I'll talk to you again." So and that never ceased. We never ever, and never would, I'm sure, reach parity, where everyone thought that they were giving just as much as everyone else.
And some of that giving was related to work rules and manning and that sort of thing.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Okay. Can you talk a little bit about some of the personalities involved here? I just mean in terms of their attitude and sort of kind of mode of operation. And if you could, there's a couple of consultants around there that I was particularly interested. One was Randy Barber. Did you have much contact with him or any impression about his?
I had some contact with Randy on more than one occasion. He was a consultant to the machinist and Charlie Bryan. Very intelligent, seemed to me. A bit naive, perhaps.
You mean in the business sense?
Yes,
Yeah. Okay.
in the business sense. Very suspicious. Very suspicious. I mean, the assumption was that management is out to stick it to me, or stick it to the union any way that they can. It was the absolute assumption that management is on one side of the street and we're on the other, and the only thing we have in common is the fight.
Okay.
That appeared to be Randy's perspective. A good contributor at meetings. He had some good ideas. Not all of his ideas were good, but hell, I mean, not all of anybody's ideas are good. But he made them well and forcefully. He was an articulate arguer. A bit left for me, which is to say that I get the feeling that politically he was more socialist. I don't mean he was, but his philosophies were more social than mine. I had the feeling, although I have no evidence of it, that he could be a bit Machiavellian in his dealings with people. He tended to be a bit manipulative. All of this, is my gut. I have no. My personal dealings with him have been straightforward, sometimes confrontational, but straightforward. But I'm giving you part of what I heard from other people, and part of what my 25 years of observing people professionally tells me.
Yes.
Quite apart from my personal dealings with him.
There was another guy there named Freeman. Did you have anything to do with him that was
Yes.
also a consultant?
Yes.
Yeah.
Brian Freeman's only interest, it seems to me, was making money for Brian Freeman.
Hmm.
I don't believe he had, honestly, the interests of the union or the company at heart. Randy Barber, I believe, honestly had the interest of the machinists' union at heart.
Mhm.
I believe he was motivated in that way. Brian Freeman was motivated by Brian Freeman, and would walk, any side of any angle or any side of any street in order to advance whatever he thought could best be advanced for Brian Freeman.
Hmm.
And in the long run, he didn't do himself any good. He wore out his welcome with the management of the company in a few months because management was able to see through him. And I think he wore out his welcome with the union for the same reason. He tried to walk too many sides of too many issues at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
No one knew what he stood for or where he stood, and he had.
Okay, you were just talking about Freeman.
He came in at the request, I believe, of one of the unions, perhaps the pilots union. I'm not sure about that. I've forgotten now which union. And began to adopt their position and adopt their line of argument, looking for some financial solutions. But the more we did there, the more he seemed to waffle on everything, and he lost credibility with everybody. Unlike Bill, who didn't adopt anybody's position necessarily, and really tried to be I don't want to say mediator, an ombudsman for both parties, both the management and the unions, and tried hard not to take a position publicly, or even perhaps privately, except where he thought it was in the best interest of maintaining the viability of the company. And he leaned on Frank and others to take the union position in some cases. Brian was just all over the place. I think Brian, in the long run, may have been a detriment to the party.
Mm-hmm. The role that Usry played was unique in the sense that he was actually on the payroll of the consultant to management, but yet had this. Well, you described it as ombudsman. Can you say more?
He had entree to all three unions and to the management of the company. And the miracle of it is that he maintained that entree and that credibility with all the unions, as well as the non-contract employees and management and the bankers and the board, for as long as he was involved. That is nothing short of a miracle in that environment.
Mm-hmm.
Plus, he had the stamina and the guts to put up with all of it, which is more than I had.
Yeah, it does take some of that, doesn't it?
It takes a lot of it. Mm-hmm. My hat is off to him. I couldn't do it.
The press has made quite a bit over Charlie Bryant, referring to him as Chairman Charlie or something like that.
Well,
is that a fair assessment of him? Or
let me go back to the negotiations that took place at the end of '84 and the beginning of '85, where we were about to go into technical default on the loans. We needed to have negotiated settlements with all three of the unions again. And we adopted, and we sat down and talked to each other way back in June and July and said, look, folks, if this thing is going to work, we've got to keep this all to ourselves. I went back to repeat what I had said when I first went on board. And so we got through some very, very tough and anguished negotiations during the fall and winter of '84 and into January and February of '85 by keeping it all in-house.
Mm-hmm.
Traffic didn't suffer. We were at times minutes, hours away from filing Chapter 11, and no one really knew it. Everyone abided by the ground rule. Charlie abided by the ground rule, and he kept the machinist in line. The pilots abided by the ground rules. The flight attendants occasionally strayed because they lacked really strong leadership. And as for the company, we certainly abided by the ground rules. And Frank said, nobody talks to the press except McGraw. Nobody. Unless I set up with somebody. And boy, mum was the word.
Mm-hmm.
We just said absolutely nothing unless it was positive about anything. And the result was we lost no traffic. We kept incredibly strong bookings on traffic, even though we at any moment could have filed Chapter 11. We were just that close. We went into technical default and stayed in technical default for several days, and nothing happened. We worked marvelously. Then, of course, there's a tremendous upswing in the marketplace, and the first 2 quarters of the year made money, made a net profit for the first time for 3 consecutive quarters, the 4th of last year, or 4th of 84, and the 1st and 2nd of 85. And then in the 3rd quarter, the bottom began to fall out of the market. And we began to see that the promised profits were not to be, and the finger pointing and wagging, and people beginning to protect themselves against the known eventuality of another program, and people began to go public. And I don't know who went public first. I don't know. I left about that time, and Charlie. Well, I don't want to say anything that is libelous or slanderous. Charlie clearly grabbed the headlines whenever he had an opportunity, whenever he thought it would benefit his cause. He publicly disavowed any desire to be chairman of Eastern, although I am told he made those statements privately. He put himself on the same plane as Frank, when in my opinion he couldn't carry Frank's lunch bucket in terms of ability to manage an airline.
Mm-hmm.
And knowledge of the airline business and industry. Charlie Bryan is a machinist who, if the term applies, was Peter principled above and beyond his capabilities as a machinist. That's my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
I do not think he was an effective negotiator for the airline, or not for the airline, but for the machinist union. Had he been, they wouldn't have been sold. There would have been a way for the company to maintain what they needed to maintain and to keep all the jobs. And I think Charlie could have come out of it all right. But Charlie over a period of time, and I don't know the genesis of it, but Charlie and Frank didn't get along very well. I don't know when it started. I don't know why it started, but they clearly did not get along well. They put on a good face publicly sometimes, but at other times they just didn't get along well. Charlie was certainly not a threat to Frank. I think Frank's dissatisfaction with Charlie was that he just couldn't understand why Charlie couldn't see the facts as Frank saw the facts. And I think Charlie was incapable of doing that. I think Charlie felt or saw that there was something wrong in accepting and seeing facts the way that Frank saw the facts. You know, facts are facts. They are as they are. But Charlie refused to accept them as that. You know, this deep distrust for Frank and the entire airline management team. I don't think Charlie was dishonest. I never saw any shred of any evidence. In fact, I think Charlie would bend over backward to be honest. I don't think he was Machiavellian. I don't think he may have had hidden agendas or second agendas, but if he did, they were so obscure as to have never surfaced, I don't believe. I think he was just born and raised in the tradition of, and practiced union leadership in the tradition of the West Virginia coal mines in which he was born. Successfully negotiated, he elected his way to the leadership of a powerful union, the District 100, and was out of his league. I think he was just flat out of his league.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any contact with the International Union here in town, Peter Paul?
John Peter Paul or Weapon Singer? Only peripherally. I mean, I saw them, met them, shook hands with them, had non-substantive discussions with them, but nothing that I could contribute.
Mm-hmm. How about the other two unions, Schulte with the pilots?
Larry Schulte did the best he could with what he had. I think Larry wanted to be honest, was honest, wanted to be a leader, but the very nature of the pilots' union and its extreme democratic process didn't allow anybody to be a strong and effective leader. When you look at, only, something like 10% of the pilots elected the union leadership. Only 10% vote in union elections. So 10% elected those 16 or 20 or 30, whatever it is, master executive chairman members who lead the union, most of which are activists, very strong activists, which is why they're there. And as you know, most activists are most activists are not for the status quo. That requires no activity. Most activists are for changing or reversing or being against. Generally the case, not always the case. That's certainly the case, I think, with the pilots union of Alpha at Eastern. You had some radical, strongly radical activists who were elected as head of the union, and they just marched the union right along. They marched the entire pilot force right along. When in fact, most of the pilot force would have gone along with Frank very easily. I think Frank had a good rapport with the pilots, being a pilot himself, and I think he had a good rapport with the pilots. But the union leadership was just impossible. And again, it wasn't Larry Schulte's abilities or inabilities necessarily. It was just the makeup of the union leadership, the extreme democratic process. Larry couldn't turn around without being told by the MEC that he could turn around, and if so, in which direction, how far. Maybe a stronger leader could have done better. That is certainly the case with Callahan,
yes,
with the flight attendants union. The flight attendants union lacked strong leadership at all. I mean, it was a union that cried for strong leadership, and Callahan was just unable to provide it. Callahan perceived himself an intellectual, and was just incapable of providing good, strong leadership at a union at a time that it needed good, strong leadership. Now, I suppose one could say that a strong flight attendants union is not is an anachronism, because at any given time there are 12,000 people waiting to be flight attendants at Eastern Airlines.
Yes. Yeah.
So a strong union is nonsensical in one sense, because if let them all go if you need to and hire the replacements. TDBA is going through that right now. Except that you run into the problem of other unions respecting the picket lines. And that's the problem that TDBA is having right now also.
Mm-hmm.
The machinist unit don't want to cross the picket lines.
They did get a restraining order
Oh, did they?
today, yes.
Kansas
Yeah,
City?
yeah, Kansas City, yeah. I just heard that on the news driving over, yeah. What was the leadership prior to Callahan, was that any stronger?
No.
You-
Pat, gee, I can't think of her name. Yes, stronger, but not as knowledgeable. A stronger person, which is to say less wishy-washy, less mealy-mouthed,
Mm-hmm.
but less knowledgeable, and therefore equally ineffective. Pat Fink, Patricia Fink.
Yes, I've heard that name now,
Yeah.
yes. Can you talk a little bit about the role that the union representatives played on the board of directors? Were you able to observe that at all?
Sure.
Yeah.
How so? I mean, their participation, or the way votes were, or?
Participation primarily, yeah. You had already described that there were two members on there that were primarily designated by the pilots, and then later the two others put on representing.
Yeah. The two that were on representing the non-contract and pilot groups were on, for most of the time that I was there. They both came on at about the same time, just about the same time. Art Taylor and Tommy Boggs. And they were and are seasoned executives, and while they represented, in a way, the constituency of the pilots and non-contract employees, they also were on other boards and knew the way companies operate and knew the considerations that boards had, and were able to look at financials and ask good, intelligent questions, and it was no problem at all.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't want to imply that there was a problem with either Charlie Bryan or Callahan with participation as a board member, because there wasn't. They had a very tough job to do. They had a dichotomy role to play.
Yeah.
And it's impossible to represent the shareholders on one hand and your union members on the other, in some cases where at least for purposes of board meetings, their motivations are different. Ostensibly, theoretically, they ought to be the same. I mean, what's good for the company is what's good for the shareholders is what's good for the employees. Normally, that is the case. Not always. If employee raises, unit negotiated raises, are good for the employees, are bad for the company, you have a different point of view there. However, if those raises produce financial distress for the company and threaten the company's survival, then that is not good for the employees either. But that takes a longer-term view than the people than Callahan and Bryan were willing to take.
Mm-hmm.
They were very short-term oriented people. This contract is what we're talking about. That's what they were concerned about. Of course, they were elected by their members, and felt they had to serve their constituents the way their constituents wanted to be served. In their actual performance at board meetings, they generally adopted statesman-like composure, generally. I never saw any other kind of behavior out of either one of them. They were, Charlie Bryan was particularly a strong advocate for positions that he espoused. He would be corrected from time to time by Frank and questioned severely by or reprimanded by other members of the board from time to time. It never deterred him at all.
That was for things he had said at the board?
Yes, at the board,
Oh.
not for things he did beyond the board.
Okay.
No, only at the board, except Lawrence Rockefeller on one occasion did admonish Charlie for not biting a bullet and doing what had to be done for the good of the company. And he was sitting right next to Charlie, as I recall. I think that was the case. Callahan said very little at board meetings. Once in a while, he would advocate a position, but not very often. He didn't say very much or do very much.
The two of them appear to be briefed on what was going on and sort of up to speed in the sense that they had good advice on reading financial records or whatever the agenda was going to be?
As well as any other board member, yes. As far as what the agenda was going to be, most definitely. Plus, we made it a point as part of the 1984 Wage Investment Program to hold monthly briefings with all the union leadership, including their consultants, and allow them access to the books at that time. So every month, I mean, they had total access to the financials, had total access to the capital plan, total access to the traffic and advanced bookings and issues and and competitive data. They had a tremendous amount of it. They had access to everything that they wanted. They were not denied anything.
Mm-hmm. Well, what I'm suggesting, though, that could be a problem. If you laid all that on me right now, I would be overwhelmed by it. And so what I'm really wondering is, did they show evidence that there was a comprehension of what was being shown to them?
I'd have to say so, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Charlie did, particularly.
Mm-hmm.
Because Charlie asked good questions. He didn't, he could look at the same data and come to different conclusions, conclusions that supported his view. But yeah, he was briefed. Of course, we were paying his consultants. I mean, it wasn't the unions that were paying our consultants. The company was paying the unions' consultants, including Brian Freeman and Randy Barber and all the Eastern was paying those folks, not the unions themselves.
Okay.
They solely worked for the unions. I mean, they provided advice and counsel exclusively for the unions, but the company paid them.
Did they sit in on the meetings, board meetings?
No.
The consultants did not?
No, they did not.
I was going to ask you about this. Just flashed into my mind the picture of Borman on television doing one of his commercials. One in particular where he shows a Zoom. Did you have much to do with Frank cast in that role of the public spokesman to the consuming public?
A little bit.
Was he quite willing to do that, or was he reluctant to?
He was very willing to do it.
Good.
And for very pragmatic reasons. The ads that Frank was in worked.
Is that right? They were effective.
Frank was a bona fide American hero.
Mm-hmm.
And the advertising agency used that in the marketing of the airline and used Frank in it. And those ads sold. The ads worked. They didn't all work. The Zoom worked in the part of '85 until the mid-year when the market began to go sour and south. And that was an inappropriate ad. But Frank enjoyed doing them, but not for personal reasons necessarily, although he was very good at them.
Mm-hmm.
But the data that came back from the ad agency was that these ads sell, these ads work. So we had no trouble getting him to do them at all. Plus, he enjoyed doing them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's true that he is a hero, because that certainly is a part of the public. I view him that way. Yeah. Let me pause for a minute. Can you talk a little bit about Frank Borman?
Be happy to. I consider Frank a friend. I think you have to look at what Frank has done in his life to understand part of the nature of the problem that Eastern has today. Frank is graduated in the high percentages of his class at West Point. I don't know exactly where he was. He was a fighter pilot, I believe a fighter pilot instructor, a test pilot, an astronaut. None of those are team sports. Everything that Frank Borman has done, that he has excelled at, has been of his own will, his own drive, his own personal ability, his own intellect, which is considerable, his own stamina, his total personal competence and ability. There is probably nothing about Eastern Airlines that Frank can't do. From fix an engine, to hire the person who fixed the engine, to fly the airplane, to take tickets. There's probably nothing that he can't do, and his ability to do it and his near willingness to do it is part of the problem. Because he can do everything, because he is so good at doing everything, if you've read The 1 Minute Manager, Frank is the epitome of the person the boss who, if you've got a problem, you take it into Frank. You've got a monkey on your back, you drop it on the boss's desk, and he'll fix it for you. And Frank is that way. If you've got a problem, anybody's got a problem, they can take it to Frank, and Frank will fix the problem. You want someone fired, Frank will fire him for you. You want someone hired, Frank will hire him for you.
Yeah.
There is really, his desire to be helpful, his love for the employees, I think, in his love for the airline, and his total commitment to the airline. No one could be more committed to Eastern Airlines than Frank and Susan Borman together. And Susan plays a big role in that.
Oh, I did not.
Yes, she does. She plays a big role in Frank. And that's fine. But that has produced part of the problem, because it gives the impression of hip-shot decision-making. What it does is destructure the decision-making process, to use an awkward term. But if whoever's got a problem goes to Frank for a solution, that provides no structure to the decision-making process. And in an organization the size and the complexity of Eastern, you wind up with ad hoc decisions that are not well coordinated and not well thought out with other people that they impact on, and it results in gamemanship, it results in in-house politics, it results in a lack of communication between and among the people that report to Frank directly. There's no need to. I mean, they can take their individual problem into Frank to be solved. There's very little need for them to coordinate well among themselves. Frank was like at the hub of a wheel, and the 8 or 9 people that reported to him were like spokes running out from the wheel, and the further they got from Frank, the further apart they were individually, and the less they talked to each other. Frank had a staff meeting once a week, and that was the only time that the group got together, and the only time that serious issues were discussed, to the best of my knowledge. At least among all of the people, there were times when individual people on individual issues would get together, but the system did not permit a lot of that. It's Frank's decision-making process that thwarted that, and I think that produced some of the lack of a good flow of communication and information inside the company. His own ability, and by virtue of his own ability, the role that he assumed as the fount of all knowledge and of all decisions. Not a role that he intended to establish for himself, I don't believe, because it's not his personality. His personality is not to do that. But his style belied the personality, if I can say that. The way he operated, the manifestation of his love and desire for the airline to succeed, the manifestation of that in the decision-making process and in the communication process, thwarted what he was trying to achieve.
That's really ironic, isn't it?
It is
See,
very ironic.
the combination then really of him caring about the airline and caring about people and being very good at whatever he undertook would put him in a position where if you went in with some kind of a problem that you weren't able to resolve, he would, out of caring for you and he would
Exactly.
he would work it out. He would solve it.
Exactly.
On an ad hoc.
He would
basis.
probably disagree with that, Jerry. He described himself on more than one occasion as the conductor of an orchestra, trying to bring harmony and symphony to all the individual pieces. And while he was doing that, and he did do that, he at the same time was running around playing first violin and first trumpet and playing the drums at the same time.
Yes. Yes.
No, he was really doing both. He was really directing, trying to coordinate and cajoling people, encouraging people, compelling people to get together and communicate and coordinate. But then someone would go in with a problem. His inclination was to fix it on the spot rather than to use the same system he had just espoused. He either didn't see the connection, didn't make the connection. I don't know.
I would suppose that an organization as large as that had a consultant or two that looked at their managerial structure and decision-making process. And
Not while I was there.
Did not? Oh,
May
no.
have, but not while I was
Yeah.
there.
But at least he would not see the problem as you described it, though, because
I
he
don't
would see
think
it.
so.
He would see it in, yeah.
I don't think so. He and I have not discussed this at great length, although we have discussed some of this. I did describe the hub and spoke thing within a week. I'd been there a week, and it was so obvious. It was so obvious. And he didn't disbelieve it. He found it difficult to believe. But it was at that level, that it was at the senior staff level, his direct report level, that the employee communications broke down also.
Oh, okay.
It seldom went beyond that group of people. It seldom went beyond the officers of the corporation, unless there was a gaggle of folks that come in from all over the system for once every 6 months or so, presentation or briefing.
The Bill Essery's remarked to me that he got over-involved in this, and I took it from
Bill?
Bill, yes, that you know, his usual role would be play a less deeply involved with maybe half a dozen clients at the same time, and here he became much more involved. I know that just in terms of his availability. And putting that with some other things he said, I take it had a lot to do with Borman drawing him in. Is that, do you feel that might be accurate, that
Certainly.
that Borman could do that he would be capable of?
He'd call Bill anytime, day or night, wherever you could find him. Where are you, Bill? I need you. Get down here, Bill. I need you here. I need you here now. I need you. Why don't you stay here all next week? I'll get a place for you. How about next 2 weeks? Can you spend all the next 2 weeks with me?
Okay.
Bill was very valuable to Frank, and Frank knew that he was very valuable to him. Bill was one of the few people that Frank really, really listened hard to and took his advice. I think Bill saw that. Bill could play a unique role with Frank in terms of giving him advice, and Bill leveled with Frank. You know, he just level with him. You know how Bill is. If he's going to level with you, if he wants to, he will. And he did with Frank. And Frank accepted his leveling and accepted most of his recommendations, I believe. I believe he did, at least for the time that I was there. Bill was able to do it like most people wouldn't be able to. And yes, that probably meant that Bill spent more time there than he should have. But he saw what he was doing. He saw the opportunity to perhaps save an airline, which he very badly wanted to do, because he had his respect for Frank grew tremendously Frank is not a hard man to respect or like at all. Frank is one man who, I told Susan once, Frank is transparent. I mean, what you see is what you get. Frank is not complex. He has no hidden agendas. He's very honest. He is passionate. He doesn't wear his feelings on his sleeves, but you know where he is. You know where he's coming from. You know how strongly he feels about something. He doesn't play games with you. That's why I said that he's transparent. There's nothing to hide.
Yeah.
He is what you see. There's nothing to hide.
He's fairly modest in terms of his own his taste. Huh?
Very modest. Very modest. Yes. Not the least bit extravagant.
Did it make much difference to get another president? I mean, him only holding that has not made a.
No, and no one thought that it would really, as long as Frank was chairman. Frank is going to be perceived as the person running the airline. It may be that had they brought in someone from the outside, a very high-level, strong person from the outside, to be the president, it might have been a little bit different. But I think it was impossible to take someone like Joe, who was a fairly new hire, who had only been there 8 months or so, 9 months maybe, a fairly young person, who had some credibility with the machinists because of what he had done with the machinist union there, and make him president. I know he was not perceived as being strong enough to stand up to Frank. Stand up to him is the wrong term, but he'd also been there long enough to be perceived as being someone who is going to do Frank's bidding, even if unwittingly. If you work for a man long enough, you know what he wants, you know what he likes, and you're likely to go ahead and do that without ever raising an issue. Someone, perhaps on a peer level with Frank, coming in as president, who had had a similar position in another airline, wouldn't do that. Would have his own biases. And Joe's growth, his progression from where he was when Frank hired him from Eastern or Frank hired him from American to Eastern, was just so rapid that Joe didn't have a chance to develop his own credentials, if you will.
Was there anybody considered from outside at the time?
To my knowledge, no.
Yeah. So, what had Leonard done with the machinist that you said he had a good reputation with them?
The employee involvement program, Joe had been a strong supporter of. He had negotiated with the local machinist union leadership very well in getting higher productivity and reducing head count, but also in bringing work in from the outside that hadn't been done on the outside that could be done inside by machinists. In other words, he didn't ask for anything that he didn't give himself. He asked for something, but when they asked for something in response, he'd give it, and like bringing work in from the outside. They produced for Joe, and they got credit for producing for Joe, and of course that encouraged more production. Joe was not the least bit reluctant. In fact, he was aggressive in giving the machinists credit for what they achieved, and he did it very well.
You characterized that 2 years you spent there as a bad period in your life, looking at your whole work history. Yeah.
It was a lifetime.
Yeah. You come away from it wiser about the world?
I'm wiser about a lot of things. I learned a lot, but it was an anguishing 2 years. It was a distressful 2 years, physically, emotionally. I wouldn't want to go through it again.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not the level of work. Like Frank, I take my job emotionally and very seriously. But I was unable to deal with it on the same level that Frank was. I had, physical manifestations of the work. The hours were not the problem. Hell, I could work hours and have all my life worked long hours. But it was the inability to do what I was hired to do, and the harder I tried, the behinder I got.
Yeah.
Knowing that Frank was the reason that I couldn't do what he hired me to do, but his style precluded me from doing it. To stay there would have been dishonest.
Mm-hmm.
Because I knew I couldn't do it as long as he was there, and I couldn't advocate Frank's departure. Now, I couldn't do that. I couldn't say, Frank, you got to leave. The solution for the company is for you to leave. So the only alternative to me was to leave myself.
Mm-hmm. Did you leave Friends?
Sure.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah, I left Frank Friends.
Yeah. I mean, you certainly talk about him like you.
And I
Okay.
told him when I was there, before I left, I said, this is just not working out. I'm not doing what I want to do. I'm not doing what you want me to do. And I think and I've been talking to some headhunters about another job. Caught him totally by surprise. But the next day he began to look for my replacement, which I would have done in his shoes as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
I would probably have told me about it, but I would have done it too. Frankly, I left Friends with a lot of folks there.
Mm-hmm. Well, I've sort of run out of questions to pose for you, and I've really kept you here
More may come
past
to
the
you.
supper time.
Well, that's all right. More may come to you. There are some other folks, I don't know who you're planning to see, but there are some other folks. This is, I assume, going to be a long project of yours.
Yes, it is. Mhm. Yeah, well, if you have some thoughts on some other people, I would sure, you tipped me off to one already. I'm not sure who I will interview at this point. Bill has sort of given me some guidance. But I would be interested in some thoughts on that, if you have others. And maybe we can quit with the idea that I could come back if I needed to.
Oh, by all means.
Okay.
Certainly, by all means. You know, somebody I think you want to see is Marvin Amos. Marv Amos was Jack Johnson's predecessor
Oh, okay.
and was there retired from Eastern, forced retirement. But was there for all of Frank's tenure. Will have an entirely different perspective than mine or than Jack's.
Mm-hmm.
Entirely different perspective. He hired Jack, and Bill was instrumental in Marv's early retirement. But a person that I think would give you a different perspective,
Mm-hmm.
that I think would be valuable to you.
Okay. All right.
I don't agree with Marvin about a lot of things. I don't think many people would, but I think it would be valuable to you to have his perspective.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Dick, let me thank you for your...
I'm looking at some names here to see if... Jack Hurst, H-U-R-S-T. At West Point with Frank.
Oh,
Is there as Senior VP for Facilities, I believe.
they go way back then.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I assume you'll think about seeing most of the senior staff there, though.
Yes,
No point
yeah,
in,
yeah.
and I just mentioned him particularly. I assume you'll try to see some people on the board?
Yes, I think so.
Who was, is it still on? The mic
Yeah.
still on?
Yeah, let me turn it off now.
Yeah.
Thanks much, I appreciate it.
Sure.
Okay.